Welcome, everyone. My name is Matthew James Weigel. I'm a Dene and Métis poet and artist living and working here in Edmonton. I am coming to you from Edmonton, which is a signing site of Treaty Number 6. And I just want to say that I'm very grateful to everyone for joining today. And I'm grateful to the treaty signatories and to the ancestral relations that inspire treaty, the ancient agreements between and among the plant and animal nations whose sovereignty we honor here today and always. I'm going to bring in some folks to speak with us today, and we'll talk about the recent papal visit to Treaty 6 territory. And so thank you so much. Let's get started. All right, I'm going to go in clockwise order around the screen. So Shani, if you could introduce yourself. Thank you.
Tanse, hello. My name is Shani Gwin. I'm the founder of pipikwan, pêhtâkwan. We recently did the communications and media relations for the papal visit to Treaty 6 territory. I am a 6th generation Métis. I have connections to the Cunninghams on my mother's side and the Fergusons on my father's side. And I'm also a descendant of Michelle First Nation. Thank you for having me today.
Unmute. Thank you. Joel, please.
Tanse, Joel Cardinal Ntsigason, Agwa Ninehi Wihuwen Kehu Gobut, Anishkova Nanik Ochinia. Hello, everyone. My name is Joel Cardinal. I am originally from Saddle Lake Cree Nation, which is my father's community and where I was raised. My mother is from the neighboring Kihiwin Cree Nation. I am calling in from Squamish Nation territory. I currently live on Squamish Nation. I'm currently in North Vancouver, but where I live is actually on the Sunshine Coast, but still part of the Squamish Nation traditional territory. Part of my background with residential schools is my father is a residential school survivor. Him and all of his siblings were sent to Blue Quills Indian Residential School near St. Paul. My father was there for 8 years. After I was done university, I worked for a law firm as part of the residential school class action, specifically with the independent assessment process that compensated survivors for physical and sexual abuse. So for several years, I've traveled around Alberta and the Northwest Territories, interviewing survivors, and many of the times they told me that I'm the only person that has heard these stories. And so I do carry a heavy weight on me. Recently, actually earlier this month, this past month in August, they began phase 1 of the search for unmarked burial sites at Blue Quills Residential School. And so I volunteered my time to go back for that week and to use my experiences interviewing survivors to help with pulling out stories from people who went to Blue Quills to help the searchers identify specific places on the site to search. My current role, I do actually currently work with the Downey Wenjack Fund as the manager of reconciliACTION. And I will pass it on.
Great, thanks, Joel. Yeah, Tanse, everyone. My name is Matthew Wildcat. I'm a member of Ermineskin Cree Nation. I grew up on Ermineskin Reserve, just down the road from the former site of the Ermineskin Residential School. And in a lot of ways, what I remember about it actually is not the school itself, but the tearing of it down and the building of a new school on top of that former site. One of the former sites, there was a couple sites. I'm also an assistant professor of political science and Native studies at the University of Alberta. And, I didn't have a formal role during the visit, but what ended up happening because of my position here at U of A is I got quite a bit of media inquiries. And so, I ended up talking and thinking about it a lot. And in part, I also ended up hearing stories that I'd never heard before just because I was so tuned in during that time. And yeah, I'm happy to talk more about it and to share as we move forward today.
Awesome. Thank you so much, everyone. I think we can just jump right in and get started with the list of questions I have for you folks. The first being that coming off of the recent papal visit to communities in Treaty 6 territory, including Musqueam and Lac St. Anne, this brought up hard and complex emotions for Indigenous peoples. As people living, working, and supporting within those communities, what were your experiences with the visit? Let's start with Shani.
Sure. It was, I think when we were asked to support this, it felt, there was just so many emotions. And I think I say that as someone that was working on it, but also as an Indigenous person. And then also, much like Joel, hearing so many stories from survivors and intergenerational survivors, and everything that was coming up for people. There were people that were genuinely excited and feeling quite blessed by the Pope coming. First Nations and Métis, Inuit, practicing Catholics. There were people that were really scared, people that were worried they were going to be told their way was the wrong way, that we can't be who we are, and there were folks who didn't care. There were people that just did not care. And there were people too that, there was just a lot of anger, a lot of emotions. And I think we didn't know for sure what was happening. We didn't know for sure if there was going to be an apology even, that wasn't clear. So we were worried about people being re-traumatized and exploited. And I think the way that we decided to support people is not typical of a PR agency. We were really supporting people emotionally and giving advice that I don't think a non-Indigenous PR agency would probably be giving. Some of the coaching that we were giving survivors was, you can back out of this at any time. And even if you're in the press conference and you decide you don't want to talk about this anymore, you do not have to talk about it anymore. We were just not worried about what people would feel if someone just decided that they just didn't want to do it anymore. Whereas, typically media training, we don't really want someone walking out in the middle of a press conference. So we were even giving messaging to community members saying, if you're approached by media, you do not have to speak to them, and you can, and try to give some tips, because they were everywhere. There were 600 media that had come to Edmonton from all over the world, people that didn't know a lot about our people, didn't know about our country, the progress that we have been making, terminology, the history. There's so much context. And some of the questions that media give on a regular basis, we were quite concerned about how they were going to be approaching this topic. And so we did a few things to support. We developed a trauma-informed media guide for all international media that was sent out, and it really provided people or media with some of the language we felt would be beneficial, how to approach survivors, and what they have been going through and where they might be at, and even to be sure to be on the lookout for mental health support workers that would be in the area. And we were even bringing mental health support workers to press conferences, and to some of these one-on-one interviews that we were organizing. And for me, I think I compartmentalized a lot of what I was feeling just to get through it. And I spent a lot of time, like I said, listening to those truths, and feeling quite protective of our people, and working with the church, I've never encountered a bureaucracy like that. And I have worked with a lot of government bodies. So those who wanted to share, we really wanted to give them a platform to do so. And but there was very little information sharing. A lot of the work was left to community and to the vendors that they were hiring and to sort of sort it out. And I also felt that the church really controlled the media. They really didn't make it easy for Indigenous people to react in the moment and um, share with media. And so we really had to push and advocate for Treaty 6 leaders and survivors to have the platforms they did. Yeah, I think I was able to hold it together for the most part. But when we did start arriving to Musqueam, I was a little worried that maybe there wouldn't be an apology or that our people might be mistreated because there was just so little information. And everything was very, very difficult to make happen. But what I ended up reflecting on was the Pope came, he left, and there's the Catholic Church, which is an organization, and then there's this human being that is the Pope. And what I felt and what I saw and what I heard was that there might be some hope for humanity. And maybe that's me being naive, but there was compassion and a willingness to understand and do the right thing. And so I think there's the system, the power structure, that's the Catholic Church, and then the people that are in that system that do not understand what the Pope may have been trying to accomplish. And they treated this trip like they probably treat every Pope visit. It didn't feel like a partnership. And so I think that's why I was so worried. But I know that the people that did meet with him, the Pope that had an experience with him, they felt seen, they had a connection, they felt heard. And I think that's important to acknowledge because they did have a genuine experience with him. But there's a lot of people that got to catch up to where he's headed or what he's trying to do. And I think there's still a lot of work to be done.
Thank you so much. Joel, could you tell us a bit about some of your experiences?
For sure. I think for me, when thinking about the question about my own personal experiences, as Shani has said, I compartmentalize it and separate it out almost from what the community and other communities are experiencing. So I think for me, that's a separate question. But for me personally, where I was at with that, the Pope's visit happened 1 week after I finished sundancing for the 4th year, finishing my 4-year commitment. I've been going through this process over the last 5-6 years of healing from the vicarious trauma that I experienced in treating residential school survivors. And part of that healing is letting go of these Western priorities and leaning back into my culture. And part of that is honoring our ceremonies that the government and the church made illegal. And so it was very important for me to do that. 2 weeks after the Pope's visit was when the phase 1 search started at Blue Quills Residential School. So the Pope's visit really did happen during a period for myself where I personally was very focused on healing my own self from the deeply rooted hurt and anger that is inside me from hearing all of the pain from the children, from the elders who shared with me what they experienced as children in those schools. And so for me personally, I didn't need to watch anything from the Pope's visit. And so I didn't watch his apology. Anything that I did see personally was snippets of things shown on social media. But for where I was at personally in my own healing journey, I don't need the church apology to honor that. It is entirely focused on my Cree worldview and my Cree culture. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Joel. Matt, I'll throw it to you.
Yeah, you know, it was a really strange event. Like it was a spectacle in lots of ways, right? And so in that way, I hope it was a once in a lifetime event. You know, for me, the apology was a necessity. The commissioners of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission talked to 7,000 people across the country when they did their work. They had enough survivors say that the Pope apologizing, on Indigenous territory was an important part of their own healing journey that had made it into the calls to action, right? And so for me, it's pretty straightforward why it happened, and I think we can be happy that those people were able to experience that, right? Like, I'm happy for those people who felt it was an absolute necessity. At the same point, though, what does it mean? What does it represent? And here, listening to Joel, I really, for me, his words around that's not necessary for everyone's healing journey is also true. And I think in a way we can be happy that it happened, but then also we need to move on. And people need to be able to find their own paths for how they pursue things like self-determination and decolonization. And so, I went to the apology. I found it in many ways to be deeply moving. I've never, there was probably about 5,000 people there that day, I'm guessing. And it was incredible how silent the place became, especially because it was a bit of a ruckus atmosphere right before then. Like there was a bit of a, as I joke with people, there was almost like a mission accomplished feeling in the crowd of like, we got him here, we did it, he's doing it. And yeah, just the way the silence washed over everyone, I'll never forget that. And for me, the experience of being there, it was moving, but what I really realized is that, obviously the ways in which we know is based on our experiences, right? But I didn't realize the way in which I would come to know and understand the apology would be so deeply shaped by like what I saw around me. That is just like, it's impossible to know in that way if you were to just read the text, right? And I think if I read the text like, as an intellectual exercise, you could tear it apart. Like the apology itself is deeply flawed in so many different ways. But the act of being there, it was so, it just made me realize how important people gathering in that moment was. And ultimately, though, one of I think the main disappointments that I had from the day was how hard it was to get tickets. And I think, again, this was something, an imposition of the decision, whoever was deciding on what the security detail needed to be like. I think it went overboard in terms of the provisions put in place and made it too difficult for survivors to be willing to make the trek and the journey out to Musquecheese, which was fully capable and ready of being able to host, I think upwards of 15,000 people was the and so that was the one thing where I really felt disappointed in it, was that more people who would have liked to have been there weren't able to come because of the difficulty of getting that guarantee that they would be let into the site. So I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you so much. Shani, you mentioned a little bit about how there was this big unknown, not knowing what was going to happen before the visit. And we've talked a little bit about everyone's experiences during the visit, but maybe we could talk a little bit about how the community seemed to have reacted post-visit and what's happening now. Let me throw it to Shani, actually.
Well, you know, like Matt was saying there, that silence that washed over, you know, it's hard to explain when you were there in person, the feeling. Like, it was even raining, like it was, but not too hard, like it was just sprinkling. And I don't know, there was, and there it was ruckus. Like at one point I remember, you know, community members coming up to Prime Minister Trudeau and saying, "Woohoo, nephew, over here," you know, like, and everyone's giggling and, you know, they're having fun. We're having fun and using humor to get through this scary feeling. And that was good. It was good to be like, okay, we're all here together, you know, having this experience. And then I found that after it was over, there was sort of this feeling of relief. I think at first, like you could, it was like a collective like sigh, like, okay, like it happened, we're mostly okay. um you know, people were, you know, taking photos and doing things, but we went straight to a press conference after with the chiefs and some of the survivors that were willing to share. And when that was over, it became clear how spiritually, mentally, physically, and of course, emotionally exhausted everyone was. The lead up to this, the actual act of being there, and going through the motions, and then we still had another day. And I we were talking a lot about how, what the fallout would be of this, like reopening this trauma. And I don't think we still know that impact yet. I think people are still recovering. Like, personally, I was joking around with you earlier that I'm still trying to catch up on my sleep. But I say that because I know that I'm also still healing my own feelings about what happened, and my own trauma that is in my own family around this very thing. And so I can't speak for what's happening in community, but I do know there was an impact. I think people after Lac St. Anne, there was something about that event that felt more community like even if you watch back the feed, like Chief Tony and Chief George are walking beside the Pope. They're talking with him. All the chiefs were able to come up and greet the Pope on stage. And you know, it's a pilgrimage that's been happening, you know, a place of reconciliation that's been happening for years and years and years. And so there was just a different feeling there as well. And I think we all left feeling hopeful, you know, hopeful that change will come. And I think people are really hoping that he will come back. Sorry to say, Matt. I think people want him to really understand us. They didn't feel he was here long enough, you know. And in order to make meaningful action, you can't do it without us. And I hope that's one takeaway the church took, is that as much as they wanted to do this for us, they couldn't do it without us. So
if the Pope comes back, I will write another op-ed eating my words. That
Matt, let's jump back to you then. How do you think the communities have responded afterwards?
You know, there was a real feeling of relief. In a lot of ways, I experienced it through how my dad and my aunties were experiencing it, which is that, you know, logistically, Musqueam played a huge role in putting on the event where the apology happened, right? And like, this included stuff like the Musqueam Education Schools Commission, which operates the K-12 schools. You know, the four nations, they co-govern the operation of their schools out there, right? And that organization put up $500,000 in hard costs to like rewire the event so that there was proper internet They like tore down fences and and then that didn't even include the staffing costs that they're going to charge back to the church. And so you even think about that. This is the school system, which is out there trying to recover from this history that has to deal with the history all the time. As my dad says, they don't just get to be a regular school. They have to be a school which has to constantly earn people's trust, right? Because that is always looming over everyone, that, this dark, evil history, right? And here they are being asked to not only they have this amazing foods program, and so they organized all the foods for all the survivors to be able to eat, fronted all of those costs. And so there's a certain irony here that the organization which has to deal with all of the harms is the one who is being called upon in order to make this happen in part, right? And not just organizationally putting up hard money. I hope to God that they're going to be recompensated for it all. Hopefully they figured out a payment plan back. But yeah, I think for a lot of people, it's now time to move on. And so that, that's my position, right? And I wrote this in an op-ed for the Globe and Mail, and it was a genuine, sincere feeling I had when it was all done, where I was like, okay, that was kind of a good way to wrap it up. I feel like it's over. We can move on from that now. Not every Indigenous person widespread, but in particular in the governments of Indigenous nations, I think they should devote their energy elsewhere. Why would you trust an organization where it took literally decades of activism and a huge amount of cost and energy to just produce an apology? Why would you think it's a good use of your time to continue trying to pressure them to do all these things when it's clear they're very hesitant to do them, right? I really feel like the governments of Indigenous nations should consider that maybe their time is better spent elsewhere than having a relationship with the Catholic Church, which frankly, we just simply don't need to have that relationship with the Catholic Church anymore. If the Catholic Church is willing to dramatically change how it behaves and operates, then yeah, they might become a very worthwhile partner to have in all of the work that needs to be done. But for right now, I just don't see it, right? It doesn't seem like a wise use of time, right? Because we have a scarce amount of time and resources and energy to devote, and I just don't see how it's there. And frankly, I think that there's a lot of other people who agree with me that they I'm glad that the Pope came and did this. And I listened to a lot of his speeches, and a lot of them I found to be deeply thoughtful, and well thought out. And I was pretty impressed at a lot of the times about what he was saying. But at the same point, he's only one figure in that larger scheme, and it has to be up to the church at a big structural level to be willing to really take up what he's trying to tell people and to change. And there's really only so much he can do, right? So that's kind of the feeling I was left with at the end of it all.
Thank you for that. Joel, what about you? How have you seen the community reacting afterwards?
Well, like I mentioned earlier, I wasn't super tuned in to the Pope's visits and what he was going. I was aware of what was going on, but at the same time, the Pope's visit and his apology, the intention was around healing for Indigenous peoples, and that was my focus during that time. But it did not involve the Pope's apology. For me, after his visit, I was at Blue Coast Residential School during the Phase 1 search. And it was there during my interviews with survivors, hearing some of their thoughts it really broadened my perspective. As Matt said earlier, the apology was absolutely necessary. There are a lot of people who needed to hear those words. And that was shared with me while I was at Blue Quills. I'm also very conscious with how many survivors and communities, they're very much leaning into the Catholic Church. And my experience in interviewing survivors who experience horrendous abuse, my mind goes to how unprocessed trauma as a child evolves through adulthood, and results in idolizing those who harmed us. And so I'm not a psychologist, so I'm not going to really break that down, but in my head, that's how I've processed some of our community members leaning into the church so much, because it, as Matt said, I don't think it necessarily has a place, but just trying to be respectful that the involvement of the church and the Pope is necessary for some survivors and some of our community members healing. And so for that reason, yeah, it was absolutely necessary.
Thank you so much. Let's switch gears just slightly. This question, Indigenous scholars and thought leaders have called on the Pope to rescind the doctrine of discovery. What would this look like for Indigenous communities and non-Indigenous communities? I know this is a big question, but if anyone wants to jump in first off the bat, please.
Okay, I'll jump in off the bat. I'll be brief, but I do think the doctrine of discovery should be rescinded, right? So, kind of again referencing back to the op-ed I wrote for the Globe and Mail, kind of saying, responding to people saying maybe this should be a first, or this is just the first step, but me saying maybe it actually is a last step in our relationship with the church. That would be one of the things I could come back around on, is the doctrine of discovery. But at the same time, the doctrine of discovery, its value is symbolic, right? Like the way in which we work out legal political struggles on the ground has to be done in a day-to-day fashion. But frankly, at the end of the day, Canadian law, how it's the foundations that it's built on, is that Canada came to gain sovereignty because it said it had sovereignty, right? Their Canadian courts have refused to rule on how Canada gained sovereignty. The Canadian courts do not say that Canada gained sovereignty because of the treaties. Canada, yes, it recognizes Indigenous title to land, absolutely. Treaties are also very real political instruments, which have clearly had an impact on Canadian society and Canadian politics. But at the end of the day, if you ask Canada, does Canada's sovereignty come from treaties with Indigenous peoples, or does it come from the doctrine of discovery? Unfortunately, a huge part of that answer is that if you trace it back, it mainly comes from the doctrine of discovery, right? So for that to be rescinded provides a huge amount of leverage for Indigenous peoples to wage legal and political battles, but it doesn't change things overnight. It only gives Indigenous peoples more leverage in order to wage the battles that we're already fighting, right? And so it gives us a little bit more, tools, and a little bit more ammo in our war chest to be able to wage this struggle that we're been having to wage for generations. But in and of itself, it doesn't do anything. It only matters how we then use that newfound leverage to go wage that struggle, right? So yeah, the one reporter asked me, do you think the Pope is going to rescind the doctrine of discovery on this trip? And I said, I will fall out of my seat if the Pope rescinds the doctrine of discovery on this trip. There's no friggin' way he's going to do that. But I think it again, I'm not sure it's a necessarily useful, worthwhile of time, but if it was to happen, I think it's for our benefit, right?
Shani, I'll throw it to you.
Well, I'm glad Matt started, because I was like, I feel the Indigenous scholar probably should take this take this one. We were anticipating the possibility. Again, we were really rolling with, walking into the abyss on this, and anything could happen. And I think we were all hopeful that it could, and it didn't. But I think, I agree with Matt, and I just it would be incredibly symbolic. I think there's a lot of legal impact for something like that. And with Joel and Matt both talking about, what's the role, what's the time, the energy, the resource that we continue. I think it really does depend on what the church is, in the apology that he mentioned, investigation. Well, that perked just about the entire audience's ears up. What does that mean? How are we involved? So again, it's like, okay, well, are we going to be involved with that? Are we going to be involved in some sort of announcement rescinding this? Because again, we can't be left in the dark on something that's supposed to be for us. And so that's my concern, is if this work with the church is going to continue, that I hope they learn from this visit, that there's so much we can be part of to make this a better partnership. And if survivors are leaning into the Catholic Church, they need to better understand that this patronizing residential school mentality that they still very much have cannot continue with our people. And so that's important to me. And I don't feel like the right person to talk about the doctrine of discovery, but I'm grateful that there's these amazing people on the panel that can. So,
well, thank you so much, Joel. I'll throw the question to you.
Well, Shani, I'm right with you with this question. Not being a scholar, and also I think specifically like a legal scholar. I think Matt raised some really good points with the impacts and considerations of what would happen with rescinding this. Where my mind goes to is, what are the consequences? What are the negative impacts on us and Indigenous communities if this was to happen? Even the potential. Is there a risk given just what is going on in North America right now with Black Lives Matter and a lot of the white supremacy? Is most of the population on one side or the other side? I'm not sure, but I do think that I get concerned about the impact on our rights, and this is where I would very much lean into Indigenous scholars, specifically those who understand the law and the impacts for this. But what I'll end with is something that Matt said that kind of helps make this a little bit more sense in my mind. The symbolism of it. When you said that, it kind of brought my mind to the symbolism around defunding the police, and if that is actually something that is needed, or is it just the statement in itself that is what is making people feel good. And so I just drew a parallel to that as well. So thank you.
Thank you all so much for your responses. Earlier this year, delegation to the Vatican, the Pope apologized for residential schools. And what do we see the differences between that and this? Yeah, who wants to go first?
I can hop in. I mean, I think it came as a bit of a shock. My impression of that visit was people were going to have the conversation about him coming here to apologize, and then next thing you know, they received an apology in person. And while I don't know a ton about what all happened, and maybe I'm speaking out of turn, but it did make an impact. Like, again, the symbolism of that, the validation, people who have, as Joel mentioned, he had heard people's stories the first time they've ever shared. because we've been encouraged to not talk about these things, that pretend that it didn't happen. And so for the leader of the Catholic Church, possibly the most powerful person in the world, I've learned has the highest security clearance of anyone in the world. As Matt mentioned, the security was very intense. Validates that for you. It's, you know, we all look for closure in the wrongs that happen in our lives, and I think it definitely had an impact. But it was very important for him to come here, to do it here, to be present, like Matt was talking about, to be there and see the survivors gathered, to see the Pope, hear it in person. That's quite impactful. So yeah.
You know, I think if we read apology, so like we could read apologies in a really critical light. You know, I think the real critic in me would say like, oh, you just use apologies to bandage up your lack of real action on things, right? But I don't always read it in that light. You know, one of the ways in which I think is that, you know, again, speaking to, this is a struggle, right? Where even though there's lots of really great work that Indigenous and non-Indigenous people do together, a lot of our relationship is also defined by struggle and conflict and like a kind of an ongoing resistance that Indigenous peoples have been forced into waging in order to ensure dignity for our communities and our nations, right? And our families. And so part of what an apology does is it sets a new minimum standard of, if you're a good, decent person, this is what your institution has said and believes, right? So before, what was the minimum standard that you could get away with as a Canadian thinking about these issues? Well, you know, there was some good, there was some bad. It's hard to say if it was wrong. You know, like you could have that position and your institutions that you participate in were kind of with you on that ambiguity of like, you didn't know what to think about it, right? Now it's clear as day, out in the light, the church committed evil, awful harms, and it's sorry for it. That it did terrible, awful things. And, you know, we can go like litigate the semantics of the apology, and obviously there was a lot of flaws there. At the end of the day, the Pope doesn't get to speak as an average Joe. Like, you know, I can say like, this is not representing U of A, this is not representing Ermineskin Cree Nation, and like, I'm kind of allowed to do that because I'm not that important of a person. The Pope is not allowed to do that. He's in charge of the church. When he says something, even though he's only really, you know, even if he says it's only on his behalf, the history will read it as him apologizing on behalf of the church, right? There, all of those like fine details are going to get lost over time, and we're just going to remember that the Pope apologized, and it meant that the church also felt it was wrong and sorry too, right? And so, you know, in some respects, it always raises the floor, and it gives Indigenous peoples like a little bit more advantage in having to constantly wage this struggle, right? And so, and you know, one thing Joel said though that is really important is like the backlash, right? And frankly, probably part of what prevented more survivors from being there was the looming threat of the Freedom Convoy, which was a very real threat, and it was something that was talked about. They actually, you know, anecdotally, I've heard that the RCMP was well in touch with the Freedom Convoy and said, like, you guys cannot show up like this. We will remove you. It will be a bad look for you. It will make our lives really difficult. But the fact that people were scared of that made the security much harder, and made like guaranteed meant less survivors got to come, right? And so like, you know, these are like, they're really difficult things to talk about. Like, it makes me angry, frankly, but it's, you know, it's part of that, I think, for people who are really committed to changing our society so that our society doesn't rest on the doctrine of discovery, it rests on a treaty relationship that we have, that there has to be a willingness to participate in this struggle in the long term. Yeah. I think that's all I have to say on that one.
Thank you so much. Joel, did you have anything to add about the delegation to the Vatican earlier this year and that apology?
Not specifically. As with the Pope's recent visit and his apology, my own personal views and for my own personal healing, it's not necessary. I don't need to have that as part of my life. I'll share something that someone shared with me while I was at Blue Quills during their search. Someone who described themselves as very Catholic before, but having in the last couple of years woken up. And one of the things that they shared with me that I will just end this question with is what they realized and just didn't like that was part of the church was that you can just do sin and ask for forgiveness instead of just being a good person. And that sat with me. That cyclical part that is almost systemic within it. So I don't have necessarily place in that, but it's for me, it's very much my focus is for those for healing and for true healing is honoring our own ways. And I'll end it with that.
Thank you so much. What advice do you have for non-Indigenous peoples who are learning about what this journey of truth and reconciliation means? Let's go to Shani. Sorry.
It's okay. Listen to Indigenous peoples. I mean, that is so key. There's so much information out there. Read the reports. So many people don't know what those reports say. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission recommendations, missing and murdered Indigenous women. I mean, is it something you want to read on the beach? Probably not, but it's worth your time. Seek to understand. If you want to take action, can't say this enough, make sure it's guided by Indigenous people. That nothing for us without us slogan, it's so important. And so we can help inform those actions and ensure that they are actually what we need and that they're not going to further harm. I also encourage non-Indigenous people not to center themselves in these discussions and these events. I see that very often, that something like this is shocking and you are going to feel things that maybe you weren't prepared for. And that's important, to feel your feelings and have your experience, but just to be careful not to take up too much of that space, because these events and these discussions are really for Indigenous people about the Pope, I guess, and a lot of the truth and the history about Canada. But really, my main advice is really just to listen, really listen. Find Indigenous people to listen to, a variety of us, because we don't all have the same perspective. We all have different cultures and traditions, and so we're all going to look at things very differently. So I think that's important.
Thank you so much. Joel, do you have any advice?
Yeah, definitely. I was going to go in exactly as Shani has said, is to listen. Listen to Indigenous peoples, specifically listen to residential school survivors and those who are open and willing to share their stories. I would first recommend accessing resources online, YouTube videos of survivors sharing their stories. The Downie Wenjack Fund, if you go on our website, we have a lot of resources out there as well. But when it comes to listening to stories, my advice to non-Indigenous people is to be very, very conscious of the emotional labor of what you're asking for. Understand that you asking to hear a story is potentially re-traumatizing someone. Understand that if this person overcame addictions or other issues that they've had in their life as a result of their trauma, that you simply asking them to open up may re-traumatize them and may re-trigger them. And so for me, having done many, many interviews, I'm very, very conscious of how I approach asking those questions. And also compensate people that you're bringing in to share their stories, and not at the bare minimum either. I think the one thing that I will end with, Shani actually already said, is to not center themselves. There may be times where when they go in, it may be appropriate for them not to say even one word, just to be simply there to listen. And I'll end it with that.
Yeah, that was awesome. Okay, sorry, I had something I wanted to say and I've lost it. I should have brought my notepad. But so the listening thing is really important, and I really want to build on that, because the ability to listen isn't just like taking someone's words on face value, right? Because whenever someone speaks, there's also like all this buried knowledge, experience, histories, which are being referenced, right? And so sometimes even the act of listening is difficult because of all that implicit information that is being drawn up when someone speaks. It may be difficult to even see it. And so this active listening is even something that you have to work on. You just can't assume that you're good at it off the bat, right? You can't assume that when you listen to an Indigenous person, you're hearing what's being said, and like there's like a genuine understanding, and it may be something you have to work on for quite a bit of time. So it's not just listening; it's the work of being able to listen well. I think, which is really, really difficult. And so, right after the event, the one thing where I was wondering, because that, like, you can tell Pope Francis he's extremely intelligent, right? And so he's kept talking about this as a pilgrimage of penance. And in his apology, he mentioned this thing. He's going to write an apostolic exhortation. I don't think I said that quite right, but part of me, I wondered, is he trying to give the church new tools in its own toolbox in order to listen and in order to act, right? And is this like this, this document he's going to write, this statement coming out of his, his trying to listen in a deep and meaningful way? Does it have the ability to give the church as an institution new tools in order to change itself, right? And so, this process of listening, it can't just be something that you think you can just like get overnight, but is the ability to draw together lots of different things that are being unsaid when people are speaking as well, right? And that's like a longer term journey that people have to be willing to commit to go down. And so then I think there's some intimidation factor, right? For non-Indigenous people out there, what I just said, it probably like, poof, you're telling me to do what? And so this is where it's actually an art. There's no IKEA instructions going to be involved here, right? We're not building, Lego figurines where you just fall, you put the pieces together. We don't have that. It's an artistic practice, because it takes skill and discretion and talent to be able to think, how do we confront these very difficult and complex situations, right? And some people are going to be better artists than others at it. That's okay. Those people are called leaders. That's, and we should want to have amazing leaders, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, who are capable of leading transformation in all these incredible ways. But part of it is that to develop an artistic craft takes practice and patience and skill and dedication, right? And we should, for non-Indigenous peoples, participating in that craft means that you have to work on it. You have to cultivate it over time. Part of it is listening. Part of it is knowing when to shut up and not say anything. There's part of it is knowing not how to center yourself. But then, I think, Shani and Joel are absolutely right that, there's a real danger, because I think oftentimes when non-Indigenous people hear this stuff, it's so shocking that they have to share how shocked they are about something, but in doing so kind of like reassert themselves and recenter themselves, right? But at the same point, if we're going to do this, it's like all hands on deck. Everyone is going to have to know how to chip in to do it. And so part of the long-term skill then is knowing how to not center yourself, but to be able to insert yourself in a respectful relationship where it's two-way and you're able to contribute something valuable to others, right? And so I see Joel and Shani as being like, okay, let's keep it pretty beginner, because that's kind of the level we're at. And it's true, that's the level we're at. But for those of you who are out there who think you've mastered the introductory steps, that's the next step, right? Is, can you insert yourself in a way where you engage in a respectful relationship where what you bring to the table is actually helpful? And that's just really super difficult, and it can only be done probably with years of practice. And so that's I think that's, for some people, I hope some people, non-Indigenous people, are out there, and I think that's true, that some people are, but it's, for most people, you need to do the beginner steps before you're capable of knowing how to reinsert yourself in a way where you can be helpful and productive.
Thank you so much. I love that listening is an artistic practice. It's a beautiful, beautiful sentiment. So knowing those challenges, I think what we'll just kind of wrap up with one last sort of closing question is, what changes? What's the next step? I don't know, maybe Joel, do you want to jump in?
As I've been sharing, my focus hasn't been on the Catholic Church, Pope's visit. It's been around the healing from the damage that's been done by the Church itself. So does anything change because of this visit? Well, 2 weeks after the visit was when Blue Quills started their search for unmarked burial graves. We had set up about 5 teepees out front of the building. It's one of the few residential school buildings that still exist. And we did a pipe ceremony on the second day with my dad, and my dad was there for 8 years, and I know he experienced a lot of very bad things there. And after the pipe ceremony, he shared with us that he never liked coming to Blue Quills. It's not something that he wanted to do. That he had a really hard time sleeping the night before, knowing that he had to come here and do this ceremony at the place where he was beaten for speaking his language. And so he had a lot of anxiety, but what he shared after the ceremony was that through doing that ceremony there on those grounds, it was a letting go of a lot of the hurt that comes with that place, that comes with the church. And by day 5 of the search, my dad came every single day after the pipe ceremony. He told us that on the 5th day, when he woke up, he's like, I need to be there. And for me, that's the change that's happening. It's not necessarily connected to the Pope and the church, although it is for many, many people. The change is actually letting things go, moving forward, and healing.
Thank you for that. Matt?
Yeah, I remember the one thing I wanted to say, which is that I think a real deep grappling with it all is realizing that what was upsetting to many people was not the bringing up of old harms and traumas, but what was upsetting is realizing that we still live in a situation where Indigenous peoples experience deep harms every single day in all sorts of different ways. And I think particularly for young Indigenous peoples, that's what was so upsetting about the whole process is, how can we, this moment of catharsis, how are we supposed to participate in this when all these harms are still like present in such a deep way? And I think that there's something really important about that, is realizing that, that was the trauma of the event, was not the digging up of the past, but what of the being cognizant of the present. And I think for people to move forward, that has to be a huge part of it, because this is the situation we find ourselves in. This is where we have to push off from in order to go somewhere different, right? It's just grappling with what exists right now. And so that's where I think that's my final thought.
Thank you. Shani, we'll end off with you.
Sure. Yeah, it's so key. Like, a lot of Canadians feel that about a lot of these apologies that our communities get, that, well, the apology happened, and so that boot of oppression just automatically is lifted away, and and now we're fine and we should move on. But obviously that can't happen, and it is the stark reality. Stark reality is we're still standing in Musquatchie, where they paved a road for the Pope, but not the rest of the roads. And, there's lots of jokes happening in Musquatchie over there about the roads, and maybe the Pope would go for a coffee at the mall and they could pave the parking lot and all those sorts of things. But I do think that, this is my positive thinking is, I do feel a hope for humanity, to be honest. I really, truly do. Was this a PR opportunity for the church? 100%. In my opinion, yes. They treated it like every other visit. They were totally prepared to prop our people up and not truly understand the impact of that. The theme was walking together. I didn't see a lot of that in the lead up. But, I think I really have to commend Treaty 6 for, honestly, and this is going to sound very egotistical, but for involving us, because I think we saw an opportunity. They saw an opportunity to change the hearts and minds of people across the world about who our people are. We could share how beautiful and resilient our culture is. No matter what happened to us, we clung to who we are, and we are surviving, and we are thriving. Like, it might not look like that to the rest of the world and how they expect society to be, but we are thriving, and our truths were heard. And our history is known now in Canada in a way that it never was before. I don't think. And that creates accountability. And so the more people know, the less likely this will ever happen again, And as Joel mentioned and Matt talked about, like, the environment is changing. There's other aspects of the world that create fear. But there were a lot of people, like, even with the announcement that the Freedom Convoy might come to Musquatchie, like, being in Alberta, I was shocked at the support behind that statement from the Musquatchie chief asking them not to come. Like, that made an impact for me, that people stood so strongly behind the leadership. And so changing systems takes time. But I did feel that there was a shift in hearts and minds, and I'm truly happy about that. And what I do worry is how hurt our people are, and that I hope that this visit is followed up with some sort of action. And I think it's just that commitment to the things that they talked about. The Pope specifically, the investigations and whatnot. I really hope that we're part of that. I know it means a lot to people to be part of that process. But yeah, like I said, I think he's going to be back. I think he's going to be doing some visiting. He's going to have some red rose tea with some cookums, and I don't know what's going to happen, but I heard a lot of that he has to come back. He has to visit with us. He needs to understand so that they can reconcile in through action. And yeah, I think the system behind the Pope, they don't quite get it. I think they hopefully can with Matt sharing that the Pope is working on some new tools and pieces, but they just can't continue to patronize us and use that same residential school mentality with our people anymore. It's just a no-go. I do have a TikTok to share, which I forgot to share earlier, but someone on my team made it about Trudeau and the Pope, and that we feel that there was like tension about whether the doctrine of discovery would be actually rescinded. And it's just them making super weird, awkward eye contact for the entire arrival at the airport. So I'll put it in the chat for everybody.
Thank you so much. I think that's a great place to wrap up. Marcy Cho, thank you so much to Matt, Shani, and Joel, and for all of you for joining us and listening to us today. Thank you so much, Marcy Cho.